Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Dr. Barbara Roberts. She was Raymond Patriarca Sr.'s doctor at one time. Raymond was the boss of the Patriarca crime family. He is the reason the crime family's named the Patriarca crime family. He served as the boss for many years. Barbara got to know him and his family. Barbara was also in a relationship with another alleged boss of the Patriarca crime family named Louis Manocchio. Both Raymond Sr. and Louis were very tough men on the street. They had lots of respect as well. So as we dive into Barbara's story, it's different. She wasn't a Mafia person, she was just a doctor for Mafia men. And she had a relationship with a Mafia man. She's got one hell of a story. Please subscribe to my channel if you want to get more interviews like this. And without further ado, let's get into Barbara's story. Hey Barbara, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Adrian. How are you doing?
Oh, really good. I've been excited for this interview. I really appreciate you taking some time and coming on my show and we're gonna listen to your story.
Well, it's my pleasure, Adrian. I appreciate your inviting me.
Oh yeah, well you got a hell of a story that not a lot of people can say. You were a doctor for Raymond Patriarca Sr. He was the alleged boss of the Patriarca crime family. So I really want to get into that and how did that come about and what was the
Sure,
first encounter? Just
sure.
go into much detail as you want about that.
Okay. Well, this is how it came about, and we're talking the late 1970s, early 1980s at this point. I had moved to Rhode Island after being on the full-time faculty at Penn State's medical school in Hershey, Pennsylvania for 2 years. And I moved to Rhode Island because I had contacts there that made it easy for me to get hospital privileges and cath lab privileges. And in those days, and even today, cardiologists are dependent on other physicians for referrals. So in order to get my name out there in the community, I started attending various medical conferences. And one in particular was called the Cardiac Catheterization Conference, and it was held weekly at the Miriam Hospital where I admitted my patients. And at a cardiac catheterization conference, you discuss patients who have undergone that diagnostic procedure in the previous week, and you discuss what's the proper way for them to be treated. And one day at the cardiac catheterization conference, this older, very bombastic cardiologist, who's a man, was holding forth at great length about how he thought a certain patient should be handled. And I disagreed with him, and I said so. And he was sort of very taken aback and miffed that this, young woman was daring to question his authority, but I wouldn't back down. And there was a cardiac surgeon in the conference that week, and he leaned over to the nurse sitting next to him and he said, "Who is that woman?" And she said, "Oh, that's Dr. Barbara Roberts. She's the new cardiologist in town." And he said to himself, "That woman has balls." And he started referring me patients. And one of the first patients he referred to me was a man by the name of John Cicilline Sr. And John Cicilline Jr., his son, everyone called him Jack Cicilline, was the preeminent criminal defense attorney in Rhode Island. And Dr. Bob Indalia, referred me his father when he had a massive heart attack. And he was first admitted to South County Hospital in the southern part of the state of Rhode Island. And by the time he was transferred to the Miriam, where I practiced, the damage had been done, and there was very little we could do for him other than manipulate his medications. And he was in the coronary care unit for 6 weeks before he died. And during those 6 weeks, I became very good friends with Jack, his wife Sabra, his brothers, his sister, his 5 children, and many of Jack's friends, among whom was Raymond Patriarca Jr. Now, Junior, the only son of Raymond Patriarca Sr., told me that he was very unhappy with the care his father was getting from his cardiologist. Now, Raymond had been diabetic since the 1940s, and he had had a heart attack in the 1960s. So we're talking 20 years later for the heart attack and 40 years later almost for the diabetes. And knowing as I did that both of these are progressive diseases, I figured there's a good chance his father was quite debilitated and quite ill. Mm-hmm. So when he asked me to see his father as a patient, I said, sure. As far as I knew, his father wasn't facing any legal problems. He was living quietly at home with his second wife, Rita O'Toole Patriarca, his first wife having died. And he lived in a town not far from Providence called Johnston. And so Raymond Jr. called my office and set up an appointment for me to see his dad. But in the meantime, he was admitted to Fatima Hospital with a gangrenous toe, which is a dreaded complication of longstanding diabetes. And he actually had to undergo a toe amputation.
Oh.
So when Junior told me this, I said, no worries. When your dad is discharged, just set up another appointment, which he did. But within a few days of being discharged from this other hospital where he had had the toe amputation, while he was eating dinner at his home in Johnston, two policemen, one a state policeman, one a Providence policeman, by the name of Vinny Vespia and Richard Tamburini, showed up at his door and arrested him on charges of accessory and conspiracy to murder based on the testimony of an informant. Now, I happened to be in Jack's office that night because Jack and his brother Steve were representing me in a custody battle, which had been brought against me by the father of my youngest daughter, whom I had never married. But he was suing me for palimony, common law divorce, and custody of our little daughter on the grounds that I was an unfit mother. So I was in Jack's office that night, and suddenly a friend of Junior's by the name of Maddie came rushing in, pale as a ghost, saying they just arrested Junior and took him to the Scituate State Police Barracks. And he was so upset he didn't finish dinner, and he forgot his nitroglycerin. And Rita and Junior want one of his doctors to check him. And I said, well, but we can't reach any of them, he said. So I said, let me try, because, I knew some phone numbers that someone other than another physician might not know. And I tried it. I couldn't reach any of them. And in my own mind, I had already, accepted this man as a patient. And Maddie kept insisting, no, someone's got to go out there and check him. Someone's got to check him. They're very worried because he took his insulin and he didn't finish dinner. So I finally said, all right, I'll go and check him. So one of the younger attorneys in Jack's office drove me out to the Scituate State Police Barracks. And that's how it all started.
Wow. So what was your initial thoughts, with taking him on? Because I'm sure you got a lot of heat from it. I mean, from your book, I know you did.
Yeah. Well, as I was being driven out there, I started thinking, oh my God, Barbara, what have you gotten yourself into? But then I thought, you know what? Just treat him as if he were any other patient. Now, I expected when I got there that everybody would be standing around with long faces, talking quietly, being very solemn and serious. I get there, and it's more like a rowdy tailgating party at a college homecoming weekend. Everybody's laughing uproariously, and Jack is making jokes with the cops and the prosecutors. And he's introducing me to everybody. Oh, this is Dr. Barbara Roberts. She's Raymond's cardiologist. And Raymond was nowhere to be seen. And Jack told me that he was in the office of Major Lionel Benjamin, who was second in command of the Rhode Island State Police. Jack said, I'm going to go in and tell him that you're here to check him. And so he came out and he said, okay, he'll talk to you. So I went in the room and I looked at him. And the first thing I thought to myself was, oh my God, he's so tiny. Because he was like a shriveled up old Italian man. He looked like an ancient cobbler, not a crime boss. And the second thing I thought was, holy shice, this man looks like he's going to have a cardiac arrest any minute, and I'll never be able to resuscitate him, because he was sweaty. He was cyanotic. He was having difficulty breathing. And when I asked him if he was having chest discomfort, he said yes. And I said, how long has it lasted? And he said 2 hours. Jeez. And I said, have you taken nitroglycerin? He said, no, I forgot it at home. At which point Major Benjamin pipes up, oh, Doc, he can borrow one of mine if he wants. And I said, no, thank you, but I don't think that's a good idea because I'm not sure what dose he's on. But someone was sent to get his nitroglycerin. In the meantime, I said, can I examine you? So I examined him. And when I listened to his heart, I really became alarmed because he was having a lot of extra beats. His heart rate was highly erratic. And a lot of extra beats in the setting of prolonged angina, what we call unstable angina, can be a harbinger of sudden cardiac death. So I said to Mr. Patriarca, I said, I'm really worried about you. I think we need to bring you to the hospital. So I said to Major Benjamin, this man has to go to the hospital. And Major Benjamin said, oh, no way. He's just been, charged on a capital offense. You can't. And I kept insisting. So finally he said, well, call Colonel Stone. Colonel Stone was the long-term head of the Rhode Island State Police. So I called Colonel Stone and I explained the situation. I said, I need to take this man to the Miriam Hospital. He said, no way. He's just, been charged with a capital crime and we're not going to let you take him anywhere. And I kept insisting. As you can see by just what I've told you so far, I can be a bit of a bonehead. So I kept insisting. He finally said, well, call the state police surgeon. So he gave me the name and number of the state police surgeon. I called him. I gave him the results of my history and physical exam. And he said, oh, Dr. Roberts, you're absolutely correct. This man has to go to the hospital immediately.
Jeez. So why did they not want him to so bad?
Well, because, I don't know, maybe they thought he could escape from the hospital or something. Who knows? But they wanted him under their control, not in the hospital. So I called Colonel Stone back and I said, Colonel Stone, the police surgeon agrees with me that this man has to be hospitalized immediately. He said, well, I want him to go to Fatima Hospital because that's the only place where we can put him under 24 hours a day, 7 day a week guard. And I said, that's not true, Colonel Stone. I said, because I had this inspiration. I said, do you remember Anthony Sfamini? Anthony Sfamini, who was also a client of Jack Cicilline's, while he was out on parole, had been shot in the head, rolled up in a blanket, stuffed in the trunk of a car, and left for dead. But he was found, and he was resuscitated, and he was brought to the Miriam Hospital, where he was under 24-hour day, 7 days a week guard. And I knew that Colonel Stone knew this. So when I pointed it out to him, he begrudgingly agreed to let me take him to to the Miriam, because I couldn't take care of him at Fatima. I didn't have admitting privileges there. Plus, I wanted him in a place where, if it was necessary, we could do a cardiac catheterization. Although, chances were that he had inoperable heart disease. But anyway, so they put us in the back of a state police cruiser, and we had armed guards sitting front and back, and we drove off into the night to the Miriam Hospital, where he was admitted for what turned out to be a 6-week hospitalization, because not only did he have very difficult to control angina, he also, we found out, had developed osteomyelitis in the bone of the toe that had been, the remaining bone of his foot where he had the amputation. So he had to be on IV antibiotics for 6 weeks. So anyway, that began what was a series of multiple hospitalizations over the next few years. And I'll tell you a funny story about how I got the name for my book, my memoir, which is called The Doctor Broad. A couple of days after he was admitted to the hospital, and this was front page news in the Providence Journal, which was the big newspaper in Wales, front page news the next day after he was admitted to the hospital. But they didn't identify me by name until a couple of days later. So when that happened, I got a call from a young man that I had dated briefly when I first moved to Rhode Island. And even though we stopped dating, we became good friends. And he called me and he says, hey, Doc, I got a funny story to tell you. I said, okay, what is it? He said, remember my friend so-and-so? I said, yeah, I remember him. He said, he called me yesterday and he said, hey, Minnie, remember that Dr. Broad you used to date? He's the old man's doctor now. I thought this was hilarious because Dr. Broad was a woman with large breasts and small frontal lobes of the brain. And I was just the opposite. At least I was sure I didn't have large breasts.
Well, that's a good name for the book. I mean,
yeah,
that's a pretty funny one. I was wondering where it came from, but
yep.
I guess that explains it.
Yeah.
And so then, I was gonna say, at this time, he was in bad shape when he was first admitted, but over the next few years, you got it kind of under control is what it sounds like for a little bit. As much as it could be. He was still in a lot of bad condition, but.
Right. But the problem was that he had very easily provocable angina. Now, angina is a symptom that people get when their heart is starved for oxygen. And we know he had disease in the arteries supplying his heart because he had had a heart attack, 20 years before. And people used to say to me, well, how do you know he's not faking it? And I said, it's very easy. When someone has angina, they develop characteristic changes in their EKG. There's something called the ST segment. And the ST segments become depressed on the EKG strip when they're having angina. And there were multiple times when he was hooked up to a monitor, for example, in courtrooms. and he would develop angina from the stress of hearing the testimony against him, and he would have severe angina, and we would see those characteristic changes in his EKG. In addition, both the state prosecutors and the federal prosecutors hired their own cardiologists to see him and examine him and write a report, because they were hoping that they would contradict what I was saying about how sick he was, and not one of them contradicted what I had to say.
So with them, I know they were probably really wanting to get him for anything at that point.
Yes, and that wasn't his only. A couple of months later, he was arrested. He was still in the hospital at the time on another charge of accessory and conspiracy to murder, based on the word of another informant. And then a year or two later, he was charged along with some lawyers who worked for a law firm called Coya and Lepore and were involved in the laborers union. He was charged with labor racketeering, and that was being that case was being run out of the federal court in Miami, Florida. So he had there were multiple courts trying to get him in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, and in Florida, trying to get him and put him on trial. And it became very apparent to me within a day or two that putting him on trial was tantamount to a death sentence, that he would not survive a trial because it would precipitate severe and prolonged attacks of angina, if not a heart attack or sudden cardiac death.
And I know you eventually had to start going into these courts, wherever they were at, and kind of not representing him, but just, I guess that I would say that, because, you had to give his statement like he's not medically fit to stand any trial.
Exactly. As I said, there were multiple times when I was called upon to testify about his health in court. And one sticks out in my mind because the prosecutor, who was a woman, kept asking me the same question over and over again. She would just rephrase it a little differently each time. And the gist of her question was, well, if this guy is as sick as you say he is, how come he's not dead by now? And finally, I got exasperated and I said, look, only God in her wisdom knows when someone's going to die. And the whole courtroom burst into laughter. And the prosecutor actually said, I like that answer.
So she backed off after that.
She backed off, yes.
Wow. So they were really going full pursuit on him because they just wanted to make sure that they could get him for anything and that he would serve time, is what it sounded like.
Yes.
No matter what, that they wanted him to die in prison.
But as I said, just putting him on trial, I thought would kill him.
Yeah. There was times that from the book, he broke down in the courtroom and just really, he had like attacks and stuff in the courtroom.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes, he did. Once we were in the courtroom in New Bedford, he was being arraigned on another accessory and conspiracy to murder charge. And I happened to look at the monitor and the ST segments had dropped alarmingly. And I said, Raymond, are you having angina? And he said, yes. I said, you have to tell me. So I gave him a nitro and I said to Jack, we've got to leave. This man is very sick. So I made them stop the arraignment and we took him back to the Miriam Hospital. Another time he was giving a deposition at home and he became extremely upset at the questioning and started screaming and crying and, it just became totally out of control and sort of collapsed with severe angina. And again, I had the EKG on, so I knew it was for real. And I said, that's it. This deposition is over. I'm taking him to the Miriam. And rescue was called and he left.
Wow.
So, nobody, they wanted to put him on trial, but nobody wanted to be responsible for him dying in front of them.
No, I would imagine, because you're going to get heat from all directions. You're going to get heat from probably the mafia guys, and then on the police and whatever other legal battles come in with that.
Yeah, the family could have sued him. I don't think they would have, but they would certainly have standing to.
So at one point, for appreciation, they did buy you an expensive coat, right?
Yes. I started taking care of Raymond on December 4th, 1980. And it's easy for me to remember because December 4th is the feast of St. Barbara. And St. Barbara is the patron saint of earthquakes, tropical storms, and artillery gunners. How appropriate is that?
Really suiting.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was December 4th. And a few weeks later, I was in my office and I got a call from Jack's secretary saying, as soon as you're done with patients, please come up to Jack's office. We have to meet about something. So I said, okay. So I got up to Jack's office and Raymond Jr. was there with a big grin on his face. And Jack was there and the other lawyers in his office. And there's this huge, huge box, red box with, I think, a big white ribbon on it. And Junior said, this is from me and my father. And I opened it, and it was a full-length black glamour mink coat with my name, embroidered into the lining. And, the black glamour minks, that, their ads said, what becomes a legend most? I said, oh, does this mean I'm a legend now? And they said, we were just embarrassed to be seen with you out for dinner in that, that cloth coat you always wear, because I had this padded sort of camouflage green coat that I wore in the winter.
So they got you one. I mean, I don't think that caused you any heat, did it? I can't remember if a newspaper wrote an article on you or
No, the
something.
newspapers never got wind of it. Or if
Oh,
they did,
okay. This was one thing that they didn't.
right. One thing that they didn't know about, just like they didn't know about my affair with Louis. But
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's what we'll transition to here soon, because that'll be another one. But I wanted to finish up with Raymond before we move on to that. So let's see. He was battling in and out of court. I know even the police seemed to have some kind of respect for him, is what it seemed, because I know he was eating one time. He was eating dinner, and they came in and they took him in to court or something, and they let him finish eating or something like that. Do you
Well,
recall
actually,
that?
the night they arrested him, they didn't let him finish eating.
Oh, okay. Maybe I.
They wouldn't. No, they were willing for him to finish his dinner, but he was too upset.
Oh, okay. Okay. So they were going to do it, but
They were going to, right.
I'm sure at that point he wasn't in the mood for that. So ultimately, when they did take him in, was he still able to get out? Like, or was he actually sentenced at that time when they arrested him?
No, he was arrested, but he was ultimately arraigned, but he never went to trial. So he was out on bail. They did give him bail. And but and normally when I discharge a patient from a hospital with severe coronary disease, I set up a follow-up appointment in my office. But I said to Raymond, I said, Raymond, I'm just afraid that if you come and see me in my office, they'll say, well, if he's well enough to travel to her office, he's well enough to travel to court, even though the two things are very different. I said, I'm going to start making a house call on you. So every week I would go and make a house call, and Rita, Raymond's wife, would make us lunch and we would eat together. And I'd, take a history and examine him. And about once a month I would do an EKG. And sometimes I would take my little daughter, Megan, with me. She was 4 years old by this time. And he loved children, and his eyes lit up when I would bring Megan, and she loved to come and visit, because when we'd be leaving, he would slip her a $20 bill. He'd say, take your mother somewhere nice. So one night we happened to be having dinner in a restaurant in North Providence that was owned by a good friend of Raymond's, and a gentleman who knew Raymond. I don't think he was involved in the Mafia, but Raymond knew a lot of people and was friendly with a lot of people who weren't in the mob. Anyway, this man came up and chatted with us for a while and slipped Megan another $20 bill. And when he left, she looked at me, she said, Mom, I think money is a girl's best friend.
Oh, that's funny. So they definitely did have their, I mean, a lot of the people, they see their, bad or crazy side or whatever that the media and stuff projects, but it definitely seems like with family and stuff, they knew how to treat their family, I would say, or people that they were close to, is what it seems.
Right. And Raymond would be very generous to people in need on Federal Hill. Federal Hill is the Italian section of Providence. I mean, he would send Thanksgiving baskets with turkey and, everything you need to make a turkey dinner to poor families. He sent bright young men who otherwise couldn't afford it to college and medical school and law school. So, and the streets of Federal Hill were very safe in those days, because people knew that, for example, if they attacked a woman on the streets, they would get in trouble.
Yeah.
So, women could walk the streets of Federal Hill at 2 or 3 in the morning alone, and nobody would bother them.
They knew if they did, there'd be some street justice coming.
Right, exactly.
So eventually, Raymond, he ends up passing away. What led up to that? I mean, we kind of know, but what was that ultimate moment like, and for you
Well,
and for him?
I got a call at the hospital that he had been found in cardiac arrest and taken to Rhode Island Hospital, where I didn't have privileges. He was apparently at the apartment of a woman, and not his wife. And he arrested, and instead of calling rescue immediately, she called a couple of his friends. But finally, rescue came and brought him to the Rhode Island hospital, where they were, and I went over there in the middle of them trying to resuscitate him, and we were unable to resuscitate him. And that was July 11th, 1984.
So how did that impact everyone that was, I mean, you and his family and the police? I mean, did they just drop the case, I'm assuming? And,
yeah.
I'm sure that they didn't.
Yeah,
they kept
you
going
can't
with
prosecute a dead person.
Well, I mean, like with the other people that were involved and stuff like that, did they continue it?
Actually, the only case that proceeded was the RICO, the racketeering charge against his co-defendants, Arthur Coyer and Mr. Lepore.
Right.
And they went to trial and they were found innocent.
Jeez. So they I mean, would you think Raymond's death ultimately helped them become innocent in some way, or?
I'm not sure. It could have.
Yeah, I mean, deaths and stuff usually impacts a lot of different things. So, I mean, you definitely helped him out for quite a number of years and got close with him and his family, and so you definitely seen the nice side of him.
Yeah, I did. To me, he was. First of all, he was a very compliant patient. He did what I told him to do, and he was very appreciative because he knew I was taking a lot of flack for standing up for him. And he said to me on multiple occasions, I can't thank you enough. I know you've saved my life. I couldn't love you more if you were my own daughter.
Wow. So you really meant that much to him for him to consider you to be his own daughter like that.
Yeah. And I became very fond of him because, it was like a David and Goliath situation. And I was David, and the prosecution was this Goliath with all kinds of money and power backing them up. And I was just this young, cardiologist. At the time, I was the only female adult cardiologist in the state of Rhode Island.
Wow.
But I wouldn't back down, and I did what I had to do to make sure he didn't, die during a trial on my watch.
Yeah. I mean, you kept him going.
Yep.
For quite. I mean, without you, I'm sure could have ended a lot more sooner. Because
I think he would have been dead the first time he had to come to court and testify.
Yeah, because you fought for him that from that very first moment you saw him, and they weren't wanting him to go to the hospital.
Right. And the other thing was, I didn't really care whether he was guilty or innocent. I mean, when you graduate from medical school, you take the Hippocratic Oath. And central to the Hippocratic Oath are two things. Number one, I will do no harm. And number two, I will put my patient's interests ahead of my own. Not my patients who don't have criminal records, not my patients who are facing capital charges. Any patient who entrusts his or her heart to my care, I will put their interests ahead of my own. So it really was, it just didn't matter to me whether he was guilty or innocent.
And that's how it seems. I mean, once you have no, I wouldn't say emotions, because there's definitely emotions involved, but when you have no judgment, or I wouldn't even know how to say it, because you did have your good judgment and everything too, but you just have to put those feelings aside and treat them, and that's what you're supposed to do as a doctor.
Right.
So you definitely did, and you extended his life for a certain amount of time, and you kept going, and eventually, I think maybe while Raymond was alive, you did meet Louis Manocchio. Is that, did I say that right?
Yeah. And the way I met Louis was interesting. One day, I think it was a Friday, Jack I called Jack on the phone about something else. And he said, why don't you come up the hill? I'm going to take you out to lunch at the Forum. So this was a restaurant right on Di Pasquale Square. And we went there, and this gentleman greeted us at the door. I took him to be the manager. He was sort of medium height, and he carried himself with this effortless but steely dignity. He was very dignified. He was bald on the top of his head. He had short cropped gray hair. He was tanned, and he had a very slight, very slight accent, but I couldn't place where it was from. And I guessed his age as somewhere in his 50s. And, by now I was 37. And when he came to the door, he said, Jack, shaking Jack's hand, welcome to the Forum. And Jack said, hi, Louis, meet my friend, Dr. Barbara Roberts. Barbara, meet Louis Manocchio. And the name sort of set off instant alarm bells in my mind. I wondered, was this the Louis Manocchio? The one who'd been on the lam for 10 years and had only recently returned to Rhode Island?
So, yeah, he was eventually the alleged boss of the, Patriarca crime family.
Well, yeah, very many years later. But anyway, right. So Louis said, I'm very pleased to meet you. And he led us to a table near a window that fronted on the square. And he was kept busy seeing the normal bustle of a restaurant at lunchtime, but he visited our table frequently. And I had the distinct impression that he knew who I was. And he had this air of subtle authority that made his attention seductive and flattering. And when we finished eating, he asked Jack if he could give me a tour of the restaurant. And Jack said, sure. So he gave me a tour of the whole restaurant, which was beautifully done. Many years later, I became friends with the woman who was the interior designer for that restaurant. Small world. That's a typical Rhode Island story. And my impression while Louis was giving me this tour was that he was in some subtle but definite way both courting me and paying me homage. And when we got outside Di Pasquale Square, I turned to Jack and I said, is he the one they call Baby Shanks? And he said, he's the one, Jack replied, and I think you made a big impression. One of the things Louis said to me was that I hope you'll come back, and visit us again. So the next week I went back with 3 or 4 of my girlfriends, and we had lunch. And of course, he didn't let me pay. In fact, I couldn't pay a restaurant bill in Federal Hill the whole 3.5 years that Raymond was alive, and I was his doctor.
Wow, that's how much respect they had.
To make a long story short, a couple of weeks later, we became lovers. Now, we had to be very clandestine because the credibility of my testimony about Raymond's health would have been severely impacted, if not destroyed, if in addition to becoming Raymond's doctor, it became a matter of public knowledge that I was romantically involved with the alleged number 3 man in the New England Mafia. So I would eat dinner at the restaurant several times a week, and I would often bring my children with me. But the only time we went out in public together was in New York City. And that didn't happen very often because I was busy with my practice and my children. So the state police never got wind of the fact that I was his lover.
Wow. I mean, so you guys were pretty quiet about it then.
Yeah, the FBI had their suspicions, right, but they couldn't document it.
So yeah, I mean, you had to really be careful because they would think you're this mafia-connected woman, is what you kind of referred to it in the book.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, that is really interesting that you met him and you guys, were a thing for a couple of years. He eventually went to prison, and you kind of held on to him a little bit for a while. Am I correct?
Yeah, he, the charge was, again, accessory and conspiracy to a double murder that had occurred in 1968 or 69. And the other defendants had been convicted and sent to prison and completed their prison terms many years before. But Louis, convinced that he wouldn't be able to get a fair trial, had fled the jurisdiction. He was on the FBI 10 most wanted list for years. And finally, his lawyer came to a deal with the prosecution that Louis would come out of hiding, come back, and would be released on bail pending the trial. Now, nobody believed that a trial would occur because the only witness against him, a guy by the name of Red Kelly, who was a famous thief, had developed Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody thought Louis would ever go to trial, but in fact, they did bring him to trial. And when he was when he was convicted, it was one of the hardest times of my life. I became severely depressed. And I think part of it was the pressure of the fact that my life ran on two very separate tracks. I inhabited two very different worlds. In one, I was a single mother and a busy physician, a teacher, because I taught at Brown Medical School, a mentor to younger female physicians. I was a stalwart at the local Planned Parenthood, where I actually performed abortions one day a week. And I attended my children's theater and sports performances, and I raced my sailboat.
Yeah, so he definitely had.
Right. In that world, I was a somewhat controversial but respected physician. Mm-hmm. In my other world, I was a secret lover of an alleged organized crime figure and a physician whose testimony was preventing the head of the New England Mafia from having to go to trial and almost certainly to prison.
So you definitely had a lot of different things going on. I mean, yes. So, to balance all of these things had to have been, a hell of a time.
Yes, it was.
So I would imagine when he was sentenced and convicted that did definitely turn your life upside down from.
It was excruciating. I went into a severe depression. I got the call the day he was convicted. I got a call from his brother Anthony, who I had become good friends with. Anthony was also a physician. In fact, Louis had put his brother Anthony through medical school at the University of Bologna in Italy.
Wow.
And Anthony called me and he said, "It's bad. It's very bad." And I started screaming, "No, no, no." I was just like in an agony of disbelief. I was in such pain that I felt like someone had torn a gaping wound in my heart. It was hard to imagine how depressed I became. It was very difficult for me to function. It was very difficult for me to get up and go to the office and take care of patients.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely stood strong, and you were with him.
Yes. At first, he wouldn't put me on his visitors list, but eventually he allowed me to go on his visitors list, and I started going out to visit him in this, fortress-like prison, maximum security at the Adult Correctional Institute in Cranston, Rhode Island, had been built in the 1860s. I mean, the roof leaked. It was cold. It was, it was pretty horrible.
Yeah,
but as time went on, I realized that my feelings were changing, that something about the fact that he was possibly, in prison for life made me a different person. And I realized that my hopes for Louis's relief were dying. And as I said in the book, I'm just going to quote a passage: "Longing that goes too long unmet becomes a poison, an acid that corrodes the heart, and love leaks out in little rivulets of loss. I was unaware on a conscious level that this was happening. I was only aware of my pain. And as the weeks turned to months and the months to years, I was powerless to stop it." So that by the time Louis's conviction was overturned, just over 2 years later, even though we tried to get back together and we were together for a few months, I knew that I couldn't continue. He wanted me to retire and move abroad with him, and I couldn't do that to my children.
Yeah,
we broke up, and it was painful for both of us, but it was the right decision.
Yeah, no, I mean, your whole life could have went a whole nother way if you would have went with him, but
Oh, absolutely.
you probably, obviously chose the right way. And I mean, it really shows how strong you were to be able to make that decision and continue your life. I mean, because it sounds like you guys, really had a good attachment, a good relationship, but
Mhm.
it's
I mean,
just,
even my family loved him. As I say in the book, I was the oldest of 10 children in a big Irish Catholic family.
mhm.
And my parents and all my siblings loved Louis because he was so good to me. And no one that I had been married once before, but no one, my husband nor any of my subsequent lovers, treated me as well as Louis did. He adored me and he made it obvious.
Yeah. Yeah, well, like I said, there's a lot of people don't really see the good side of with these guys, the organized crime figures and stuff. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, that's why I was pretty amazed by your book and how you described Raymond and Lewis. I mean, a lot of people, they never really knew him personally like you.
Right.
So, getting the knowledge firsthand from you has definitely been an interesting, amount of time that I put in
Yeah.
to do the interview and read the book. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and anybody that wants to learn more about it, she goes into way more depth in the book. I'll be sure to put a link in the description of your book and anything else you
Right.
want me to promote.
Yeah. Thank you. I actually had two other books published before this, but they were on medical topics. And so it was writing the memoir was a complete departure. But the first book I wrote was called How to Keep from Breaking Your Heart: What Every Woman Needs to Know About Cardiovascular Disease.
Hmm.
And then my book before the Dr. Broad was called The Truth About Statins. Statins are the medicines that are used to lower cholesterol. But it turns out their benefits have really been hyped and their dangers have been downplayed. But anyway, if you go on Amazon or any of the online booksellers, you can find my books.
Yeah, and like I said, I'll be sure to put a link in the video description for your book. And I think you got a really good story, Barbara. So I appreciate you making that book and giving me the opportunity to do an interview with you.
Well, I really appreciate your inviting me, Adrian, and I look forward to listening to it.
Well, what'd you think? Barbara's got one hell of a story. She's been through a lot. Not a lot of people can say that they were Raymond Patriarca's doctor. Please comment any key takeaways that you got from this interview. Please share it with someone that you think will enjoy it. Also, please don't forget to hit subscribe to my channel. If you want to hear more about Barbara's story, please check out her book. I'll be sure to put her website in the video description below. She goes into more detail in her book about her life story. If you want to support me and my clothing brand, I got t-shirts, hoodies, beanies, and sweats, all on my website, and I'll be sure to include that in the video description below too. At the end of this video, you'll see a Mafia playlist pop up with all my other Mafia related interviews, such as ex-mobsters that were associates, made men, capos. There's also law enforcement that was involved with taking down the Mafia, authors that wrote about the Mafia, family members of Mafia men, and so on. One more thing that I'll bring up as well is I got my Mafia documentary series coming up. There's 11 episodes altogether. Each episode is about a different crime family. Please check out this trailer to get a better idea on what my documentary is about. And if you like it, please subscribe so you're the first to get it when it comes out. This life is very twisted. You never know when it's your time to go. One day you're putting in work with someone, and the next day they're taking you out.
In our days, it was very quiet, nobody ever talked about this, nobody glamorized it. It was all like hush hush.
Not a glamorous life. And again, it's not what you see in Goodfellas. It's not what you see in Casino. Some days you were dead broke. Some days you had $2,000 in your pocket. It wasn't every day. You don't know anything else. You don't know what it is to go wake up 6 o'clock and go to work. Work? What the fuck is that? I wasn't going to work.
Even bosses get murdered in this life.
There was younger guys underneath him, and he wasn't doing the right thing, I guess. He was coming out of the card game, and unfortunately, a lone gunman came up and shot him 5 times.
People who knew me would tell you I like to use the bat a lot. If I had to shoot you, I'd shoot you too. I've done that.
This life requires many mixed personalities. You have to wear many hats in this life to try and survive.
You become 4 or 5 different people all at once. And you got to go home and be a dad and a husband. You got to go to work and do your job. You got to be out in the street and be a gangster.
Bonanno family is called Bonanno family because of my grandfather, Joe Bonanno.
That life there is done. Today you have to be legitimate today.
Man, but you got to be an idiot to want to be a hooligan today.
Jail times now, like 100 years for doing
Right.
nothing.
Yeah, you'll be dead, in prison for life, or in the witness protection program.
I don't know anybody. Now, when Mafia turned their back on me, I know everybody.
There was the big flip of the Gambino underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano.
Here he is, signing autographs in a restaurant on Mulberry Street. And was supposed to be a secret organization.
He was a very, very, very violent guy. No question about it.
Albert Anastasia, he was a Brooklyn guy. He was probably the biggest killer in the history of the mob.
Michael Francis, his father, Sonny, was a really tough guy. But he really raised his son right.
If you want to see a gangster, that's Sonny Francis. And John Sr. don't compliment anybody.
This is a documentary series about the American Mafia. It includes 11 different crime families. Each episode is about a different one. The crime families include the Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo, Lucchese, the Gallo Crew, Chicago Outfit, the Philadelphia Mafia, the Patriarca, the Trafficante crime family, and the Jewish Mafia. Please subscribe to my channel to watch each episode as they come out.